My grandfather stood on the porch of the old red brick house in suburban Denver, clutching the wooden railing and staring at the Uber that dropped me off. His question hit like a shockwave. "Why did you take an Uber? Where's your SUV we gave you?" The truth was, I had never even seen a new SUV. Behind him, my mother leaned in the doorway, wearing her familiar slippery smile. I didn't know that this one simple question was about to shred a web of deceit, running for over 20 years, right here, right now. It was a brilliant, deceptively peaceful autumn afternoon in Ridgeview, the kind of Denver suburb where the leaves turn a fierce, uncompromising gold, and the air smells perpetually of pine and potential affluence. I, Morgan Tate, 25 years old and an assistant manager at the fictional Aspen Row Hotel downtown, stepped out of the Uber, paying little attention to the driver's tired wave. The house, George and Ellen Tate's ancestral anchor, was a magnificent old structure of deep red brick, nestled behind meticulously groomed hedges. My grandparents had built their company, Rockridge Millworks, into an empire from its mahogany bones. I smoothed my blazer, a habit picked up from years in hospitality, and started up the driveway. That was when I saw him. Grandpa George, 78 years old but still possessing the sharp, angular frame of a lifelong entrepreneur, was standing dead center on the wide wooden porch. He wasn't waving hello. His hands were clamped so tightly onto the railing that his knuckles were stark white. His gaze wasn't on me. It was fixed, like a predator's, on the modest black sedan pulling away. The driver must have been barely 100 feet down the road when Grandpa's voice, a basso rumble that had commanded countless boardrooms, cut through the quiet air. It wasn't a greeting. It was an accusation. "Morgan!" he boomed. He didn't even use my customary nickname. Morgs, his eyes, the startling blue I had always associated with honest clarity, darted from the retreating Uber to me. "Why did you take an Uber? Where's your SUV we gave you?" The words landed on me with the physical force of a punch. I stopped dead, my feet planted on the worn cobblestones. SUV? I remember the moment clearly. The scent of pine needles, the crisp air, the sudden, absolute silence in my own mind. "I beg your pardon, Grandpa," I managed. My 25th birthday had been barely 3 months ago. I remember it vividly. A 14-hour closing shift at Aspen Row, reheating a plastic container of lukewarm spaghetti at 1 a.m., and a hurried phone call from my mother. Diane, there was a perfunctory happy birthday, a promise to catch up soon, and a dial tone. There had been no party, no dinner, and certainly, absolutely, unequivocally, no Toyota RAV4. Before I could form another coherent sentence, the ghost in the machine appeared. My mother, Diane, stepped out from the shadow of the front door. She wore a tailored white blouse and a studied expression of practiced martyrdom. Her arms were folded across her chest, a classic defensive posture. But the smile? That was the key. It was the smile of someone caught in a lie, yet utterly convinced she could talk her way out of it. "Oh, Dad, calm down," she said, her voice dripping with practiced maternal exasperation. "It's just Morgan. The car is fine." She glided down the steps, her gaze avoiding mine entirely, focusing instead on her father. I temporarily loaned it to Lacey. You know how it is. Lacey's pregnant now, and her husband, well, you know Mark's still out of a job. She needed it more. We're family. We share. A fog of confusion, thick and poisonous, enveloped my mind. "Loaned? What?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Diane turned to me, her eyes flicking with an instantaneous, manipulative blend of surprise and mild irritation. "The SUV? Morgan, the one Dad got you for your birthday." I took a deep breath, trying to process the impossibility. I looked at my grandfather, then at my mother, then back at Grandpa George, whose face was hardening into the familiar granite mask he wore when he suspected bad faith in a business deal. "Mom," I said, louder now, cutting through the pleasant suburban tableau. "Which SUV are you talking about? I've never owned an SUV." The whole yard went silent. George Tate's next words, though spoken without shouting, felt like heavy stones dropped into a well. "The black Toyota RAV4, Morgan. It's registered in your name. We paid for it in full 3 months ago. Gave the papers to Diane and told her to bring you in to pick it up." Registered in my name. The phrase hammered at the brittle glass of my reality. A flash, a lightning-quick reel of memory, snapped into place. That day, my birthday. My phone lighting up with my mother's perfunctory text. "Sorry I missed you. Kiddo. Let's catch up when your shift is over. Not a word about a gift, not a word about a car, and certainly not a word about a brand new vehicle registered legally in the name of Morgan Tate." Diane recovered instantly, slipping into her default mode, gaslighting and deflection. "Oh, honestly, Morgan, you're so forgetful," she scoffed, lightly brushing my arm. The touch felt like a violation. "I sent you a text about it, didn't I? Maybe you were so busy with your job at Aspen Row you just zoned out. I even sent Grandma and Grandpa a photo of you standing right next to it, saying you loved it. Remember? Dad? It was just a simple mix-up with the paperwork. George, I told the dealer to make Lacey the secondary driver. That's all. Morgan can barely afford parking downtown anyway." "You're so forgetful." The words, a familiar refrain from childhood, were meant to make me doubt my own sanity. But something was fundamentally wrong this time. If a 25-year-old woman has a car registered in her name, she receives documentation. She signs loan papers, or title papers, or liability waivers. She gets a call from the dealership. She gets the license plates. I hadn't received a single piece of correspondence from the DMV or Toyota. Not one. My birthday had been celebrated with leftover spaghetti, not a 5-figure vehicle. I looked at Diane, then at my grandfather. George Tate was a man who lived and died by paperwork. For the first time, I saw a flicker of doubt break through his certainty. He had believed the story for 3 months, believed his diligent, self-reliant granddaughter had received his generous gift. Now, confronted by my genuine confusion and his daughter's over-the-top defensiveness, he had to confront the possibility that the foundation of his truth was rotten. His voice, when it came again, was cold, devoid of all warmth, and final. It was the voice of a judge passing sentence, not a grandfather talking to his family. "Enough," he commanded, the single word silencing the rustling leaves and the distant traffic. He looked directly at Diane, then his stern gaze locked onto mine. "Everyone, inside the house, right now, nobody is leaving this property until this entire situation is made perfectly clear." I hadn't planned to stay long. I had a closing shift scheduled, an early dinner with my grandparents, a quick catch-up, and an Uber ride back to my small apartment. Instead, I found myself walking up the steps, not as a guest, but as a silent prosecutor in a trial I hadn't known I was preparing for my entire life. The door swung shut behind us, trapping the cold autumn air and a history of manipulation in the high-ceilinged room. The heavy oak door of the Tate residence closed behind us, cutting off the crisp air and the indifferent sounds of Ridgeview. The air inside the living room was thick and suffocating, a volatile mix of antique polish, the faint, comforting smell of Grandma Ellen's morning coffee, and sheer, bone-deep dread. The room was Grandfather George's sanctuary, a testament to Rockridge Millworks' artistry, filled with dark, imposing furniture and a grand fireplace that now offered zero warmth. I did not sit. I stood near the mantelpiece, leaning against the cold stone, a strategic move. If I had taken a seat on one of the plush, deep-cushioned sofas, I felt certain I would simply sink, physically and metaphorically, into the decades of being overlooked. My mother, Diane, perched carefully on the edge of the ottoman, fidgeting with the cuff of her immaculate blouse. Grandfather George took his usual chair, a throne of worn leather, his expression fixed in a dangerous neutrality. Grandma Ellen remained standing by the entrance, her arms crossed, her eyes observing every minute movement like a scientist studying a volatile compound. I realized, standing there, that the car was not the beginning of the problem. It was merely the loudest symptom of a cancer that had been growing inside my family since I was a little girl. For as long as I could remember, there were always two of us, but only one had ever truly been seen. My sister, Lacey, younger than me by 3 years, was the delicate bloom, the one who needed constant tending, the princess of the house. I was Morgan, the self-starter, the smart one, the one who could handle it. That epithet, "you can handle it," became the quiet, insidious permission slip my parents used to excuse their neglect. I remember when Lacey was in high school and failed an AP history course. The next day, Mom Diane had a tutor lined up, the best in Denver, at $60 an hour, 3 days a week. It was an immediate, uncompromising allocation of resources to protect the delicate Lacey from failure. Contrast that with my own quiet struggle the year before. I was in community college, needing money for 2 expensive textbooks for my required business courses. I approached my mother, timidly, asking for a loan of about $300. Her reply, delivered with a sigh that suggested she was the one carrying the burden, was always the same. "Honey, the family's going through a really tough time right now. We're tight. You're so smart. You'll figure it out. You can handle it." And I did. I picked up extra shifts at the fast food place I worked at then, trading my sleep for the necessary cash. Lacey, meanwhile, got a new laptop for Christmas that year, just because her old one was running a little slow. This pattern hardened me, teaching me the language of self-reliance, yes, but also the sting of systemic dismissal. When I was 16, I saved every dime from working weekends at the King Soopers grocery store. I bought my first car, a clunker of a '96 Nissan Sentra. It was rusty, smelled faintly of old coffee, but it was mine. It represented freedom and my own hard-won capital. A few months after I bought it, Diane, without asking, told me Lacey needed it to drive to her after-school activities. "It's just temporary, honey. She needs it more right now." When I finally got my Sentra back, the driver's side door had a long, deep scrape down to the primer, a fender bender Lacey never mentioned. No one apologized. No one offered to pay for the repair. I fixed it myself with a cheap can of touch-up paint, the scar a permanent reminder of whose needs truly mattered. I learned to expect nothing. I paid my own way through community college, working double shifts at the hotel, just to afford the tuition and my cramped studio apartment rent. While I was pulling a 10-hour overnight shift in downtown Denver, Lacey was celebrating a lavish, family-funded wedding, followed by a 10-day honeymoon in Florida. The constant deprivation wasn't just financial. It created a chronic, low-grade heartache. The gifts I was promised, the $5,000 scholarship Grandpa George had mentioned, the heirloom watch Grandma Ellen had planned to pass down, they either never materialized or, I now suspected, had evaporated somewhere between my grandparents' generous intention and my mother's execution. I had always blamed them, my grandparents, for their supposed favoritism, for being wealthy but emotionally distant, assuming their silence meant they simply didn't care for the difficult granddaughter as much as the easy one. The car, this Phantom RAV4, suddenly made me reread every chapter of my life. I was pulled violently back to the present by Grandpa George's voice, now stripped bare of all polite deference. "Diane," he said, his eyes drilling into my mother's, the color of a cold, gray sea. He didn't shout. He simply reduced the vastness of the room to a single point of inquiry. "I don't want to hear about Lacey's pregnancy or Mark's job. That is irrelevant. Tell me, right now, where is the SUV that is legally registered to Morgan?" Diane's defensive facade cracked slightly, but she managed to hold it together with a thin layer of victimhood. "Dad, I just told you. I temporarily transferred it to Lacey for her use. It's still in the family. We're just moving resources around. That's all. It's a Toyota, not a Porsche. What's the big deal?" Her voice began to rise slightly, taking on the tone of an exasperated woman who couldn't believe she was being interrogated over such a trivial family matter. "She can still take the bus or Uber when she needs to go back to work at Aspen Row. She's responsible. She doesn't need a fancy new car just to park it on the street downtown. Lacey needs it. Morgan doesn't need it. I was just acting as a mother, making sure the resources went where they were most vital. The justification was sickening in its efficiency. Morgan is resilient. Therefore, Morgan can be stolen from. I felt the blood drain from my face, not from anger, but from a sudden, cold certainty. It wasn't about sharing. It wasn't about need. It was the absolute, casual dismissal of my right to own anything intended for me. Before George could respond, I spoke, my voice low and steady, a new, unfamiliar tone that even surprised me. I moved away from the cold stone of the mantelpiece and into the center of the room. "Mom," I said, planting my feet firmly on the antique rug. "You keep calling it sharing and transferring temporarily, but I was never informed I owned a car in the first place. I never signed a single document. I never received the keys. I never drove it off the lot. How can you share something that was never, for even 1 second, actually mine to begin with?" The question hung in the silence. It wasn't a question of the car's whereabouts. It was a question about the integrity of every single interaction we'd ever had. And in the face of that cold, hard logic, Diane's practiced smile finally dissolved. The tension in the oak-paneled living room was now a physical thing, taut and humming. Diane's attempt to dismiss the theft as a mere act of familial resource allocation had failed. My voice, low and steady when I challenged her, had irrevocably shifted the dynamic. "You keep calling it sharing and transferring temporarily," I repeated, my eyes locked on hers. "But I was never informed I owned a car in the first place. I never signed a single document. I never received the keys. I never drove it off the lot. How can you share something that was never, for even 1 second, actually mine to begin with?" My grandfather, George, watched the exchange, his suspicions solidifying into conviction. He turned to me, cutting Diane off before she could launch another round of practiced excuses. "I want to be precise, Morgan," he stated, the old negotiator emerging. "3 months ago, I specifically called the dealer. I purchased a new black Toyota RAV4 outright. My instructions were clear. The title and registration were to be filed immediately under the name Morgan Tate. I even paid an extra $700 for the premium trim package. I gave the final bill of sale and a check for the balance to Diane, telling her to coordinate with you to pick up your birthday gift." He leaned forward in his leather armchair, the sound of the hide creaking accompanying his next words. "She assured me, repeatedly, that the transaction had been completed and that you were thrilled with the vehicle. She sent a photo. I saw the photo." Diane's composure finally fractured. Her hands, which had been clutching each other in her lap, flew up in a gesture of frantic defense. "It was just a misunderstanding at the dealership. Dad, honestly, they mixed up the paperwork. You know how those places are, high pressure, always rushing the closing process." She scrambled for a plausible explanation, her words spilling out quickly, devoid of their usual polish. "I just corrected their error. They had Lacey's information on file from a previous inquiry, and I simply told them to adjust the beneficiary. I was fixing their mistake. It was a minor administrative formality, that's all. It was easier to just change the registration to Lacey since she was going to be driving it anyway." She tried to twist her deceit into a bureaucratic mishap, a small, forgivable shortcut, but my mind was already racing, connecting dots I had previously ignored. Lacey. I remembered scrolling through Instagram a few weeks after my silent birthday. There was a photo, a blurry, celebratory snapshot. Lacey standing next to a gleaming black SUV. Her caption read, "So lucky. Hubby worked so hard to get me my dream car for the pregnancy." I had barely registered it at the time, dismissing it as another extravagant gift that Lacey effortlessly attracted. I never connected the dots, never imagining that her dream car was actually my car, bought by my grandfather. A cold, investigative clarity washed over me. I needed to shatter the only piece of evidence Diane had used to perpetuate this lie. I looked at my grandfather, my voice tight with sudden, focused energy. "Grandpa George, The photo Mom sent you. The one she claimed was me standing next to the new RAV4. He nodded. Yes, dark car. You were standing right there. Tell me, I pressed, my gaze unflinching. In that photo, what was I wearing? Was my hair long, or was it tied up? Did you see my face clearly? George Tate, the man who could spot a flaw in a mahogany veneer from 20 feet away, hesitated. He closed his eyes for a moment, recalling the image that had comforted him for 3 months, the image that had validated his generosity. It was a quick shot, he admitted quietly, sounding suddenly much older than 78. Low light, poor quality. It was sent to my text messages. I saw a young woman next to the car, and I trusted Diane when she said it was you. I didn't look closely at the face. It was the confession I needed. He hadn't looked closely. He had trusted his daughter. It was Grandma Ellen who delivered the final, crushing blow. She had been silent until now, her expression a mask of slow-burning realization. She quietly pulled out her phone, not a new smartphone, but an older flip model, meticulously cared for. She navigated to her text messages, which she rarely deleted, and found the chain from Diane dating back to my birthday period. She slowly brought the phone forward, holding it out towards George, then toward me. George, look closer at the picture Diane sent us, she instructed, her voice steady and chillingly calm. She hit the zoom function, pixelating the image slightly but bringing the details into sharp relief. There was the black SUV, and standing next to it was indeed a young woman with a wide, triumphant smile. The woman was not me. Look at the face, George. Look at the hair, Grandma Ellen dictated. Morgan's hair is often tied back when she's off work, but this is clearly Lacey's usual style. And the dress, that cheap, blue floral dress with the ruffled hem, that's Lacey's favorite one from the boutique. The silence that followed was absolute. It felt as though the entire room, the very foundation of the old brick house, had frozen solid. Diane was trapped. There was no plausible way to spin this. The picture, her primary alibi, had just convicted her. She hadn't accidentally fixed a bureaucratic error. She had meticulously and intentionally staged a scene using her younger daughter to defraud her older one. My mother's face went pale. She tried to speak, but only a strangled, desperate sound emerged. She looked like a thief caught with her hands submerged wrist-deep in the metaphorical cookie jar. Grandpa George didn't even look at Diane. He was already pulling his own phone from his pocket. His jaw set hard. He dialed a number, his fingers moving with the familiar, practiced rhythm of a man who still conducted major business from his study. He put the call on speakerphone. "This is George Tate," he barked into the receiver. "I need to speak to the manager who handled the sale of a new black Toyota RAV4, VIN number starting with..." "Just a minute." He retrieved the initial bill of sale from a drawer. "The VIN is fictional VIN placeholder. It was purchased approximately 3 months ago." The voice on the other end, a polite, slightly harried salesman, confirmed the details. "Yes, Mr. Tate, the vehicle was sold, paid in full, and initially registered to Morgan Tate. Correct." "And what is the current status of the registration?" Grandpa George demanded. The salesman tapped away on his keyboard. "Ah, yes. The current owner is listed as Lacey Harper, your daughter's married name, correct? We received a request to make a correction on the title paperwork about 2 days after the sale was finalized. The request came from the customer's mother, Diane Tate, stating that the original naming was a mistake and the car was intended for the other daughter." The technical confirmation of the deliberate deceit echoed through the silent living room. Diane, seeing the noose tighten, had attempted to make the change immediately after sending the fraudulent photograph, before I had a chance to ask any questions. Grandpa George ended the call with a curt, "Thank you." He placed the phone gently on the table, his eyes burning into my mother's. He spoke, his voice low, gravelly, and utterly unforgiving, delivering the final, damning judgment of the moment. He looked past the car, past the paperwork, to the core of the issue. That was not a mistake. Diane, that was not a simple clerical error. That was intentional deception. You fabricated a photograph, used Lacey as a prop, and then illegally changed the ownership of a vehicle intended for your other child. And knowing your history, I am certain this car is only the tip of the iceberg. Grandpa George's final pronouncement, "This car is only the tip of the iceberg," hung in the air, a chilling prelude to the excavation of decades of deceit. Diane was slumped on the ottoman, her mask of maternal martyrdom completely shattered, replaced by a desperate, trapped look. It was Grandma Ellen who moved next, her actions silent but devastatingly purposeful. She stood up from her post by the door, her movement unhurried and deliberate, carrying an ominous weight that eclipsed the previous dramatics. She walked across the polished oak floor to the small mahogany writing desk tucked into the corner, which served as her home office. She returned moments later, holding a collection of documents that looked ancient and fragile in her hands. One was a thick, leather-bound notebook, its cover worn from years of use. Beside it was a stack of bank statements, printed, highlighted, and meticulously organized. She didn't look at Diane. She didn't look at George. She looked directly at me. I may not have seen the picture clearly. "Morgan," she said, her voice softer than George's, but cutting far deeper. "But I have seen the patterns. I've seen the way things intended for you never seem to arrive. I've seen the way Diane always assured us she was handling everything. I decided, a while back, after your 21st birthday, to stop relying on her assurances." She opened the notebook, the spine cracking faintly, and laid it on the coffee table. "I started keeping a record," she announced, her tone matter-of-fact. "A precise log of every financial gift George and I have sent specifically to you to ensure your financial independence." The notebook was a detailed ledger, written in Grandma Ellen's elegant, old-fashioned script. Beneath each entry was a corresponding bank statement, marked with a yellow highlighter. She cleared her throat and began to read, her voice a relentless drumbeat of betrayal. "August 3rd, when you turned 18, we sent $5,000 for you to start your savings, transferred through your mother's account, as she requested. For convenience. Morgan, what do you remember about your 18th birthday?" I was frozen, staring at the notebook. The memory was immediate and painful. "A surprise," I whispered. "Mom brought home a store-bought cake late that night. I think I was home from my grocery store shift. There was no money, no envelope. Next, October 17th, your 19th birthday, $3,000, transferred to Diane's account, earmarked for your college textbooks and initial tuition costs." I shook my head slowly, the cold certainty spreading through my chest. I remember applying for loans. I remember my mother saying my grandparents were doing well, but not that well, and that I shouldn't hold my breath for help. I worked double shifts that semester to cover those costs. The room seemed to shrink. I realized with a sickening lurch that the deep-seated hurt I carried, the belief that my grandparents simply didn't care enough to remember me, to prioritize me, was a carefully constructed lie. The love and the money had flowed, but a dam, built of deceit and greed, had intercepted the current. Grandma Ellen continued, listing the missing funds, the $4,000 gift upon graduating community college, the contribution to the fictional Morgan's University Fund that Diane had set up years ago, the Christmas gifts of $500 or $1,000 that, year after year, never materialized as cash or checks in my hand. I countered each entry with a memory of absence, a hurried congratulatory text instead of a celebratory dinner, a casual comment from my mother about how financially stressed the whole family was, the quiet dignity with which I'd accepted the lack of support, thinking it was a sign of my own unimportance. Diane finally found her voice, a high-pitched, frantic sound. She launched into a frantic defense, trying to reclaim the high ground of sacrifice. "I pooled it. Dad, I was pooling the family resources. That was a difficult time. We had house payments, the rising cost of utilities, your father's unexpected 2-week hospital stay, and Lacey needed help getting ready for college entrance exams. I was just using the money where it was most needed at the time. Morgan is the responsible one. She was working. She could sustain herself. Grandpa George sliced through her defense with a cold, devastating clarity. You never asked her, Diane. You never said, Morgan, I'm taking your $5,000 to help with house bills. Do you agree? You never mentioned the existence of the money in the first place. It was money intended for her, not for the nebulous idea of the whole family. It was not a loan. It was outright theft. Grandma Ellen ignored Diane's fresh wave of panicked tears and turned the page in the ledger. She pointed to a recent, highly highlighted entry. And this one, she said, her voice trembling slightly for the first time. This was the biggest single amount. 1 year ago, we sent $10,000. We called it seed money, to encourage Morgan to leave Aspen Row and pursue her full 4-year bachelor's degree in business management. We transferred it to your account because you told us Morgan didn't have a personal savings account yet, which was another lie. I stared at the entry. $10,000. I had been researching tuition costs for night classes that very month, trying to figure out how I could possibly save enough to afford even one semester without drowning in debt. I had eventually given up, accepting my position at the hotel as a stable, if unexciting, path. I had never heard a single word about that $10,000. It had simply vanished into the black hole of my mother's finances. Another opportunity stolen, another dream quietly extinguished before it could even catch fire. The realization settled over me, heavy and final. I wasn't the unloved child. I was the prey. My grandparents were not cold and uncaring. They were generous, loving people whose efforts to support me had been systematically subverted. All the years of self-doubt, of believing I was too difficult or not worthy enough to receive their affection and aid, were predicated on an elaborate 20-year lie. The abandonment I felt was not an act of emotional neglect from them, but an act of financial diversion by my own mother. My mother, Diane, the woman who had always claimed to act in the best interests of her family, had stood between me and every blessing, every opportunity, every expression of love that had come my way, and in doing so, she had forced me to spend my early 20s fighting for basic survival, while she used my inheritance to smooth the path for my sister. The car was just the trigger. The notebook was the indictment of a lifetime. The revelation of the $10,000 scholarship money that could have changed the entire trajectory of my life, shattered my composure. But the shock was quickly replaced by a cold, searing clarity. I wasn't going to cry. Not here, not now. Tears would only give Diane the emotional high ground she always craved. Grandpa George recognized the shift in me. He looked away from the damning ledger and met my eyes. The deep blue now filled with a crushing regret and a desperate need for the full, unvarnished truth. Morgan, he said, his voice quiet but commanding. Completely unlike his previous stern business tone, it was the voice of a man asking for a confession that would ruin his life, but that he needed to hear anyway. Tell us everything, every single instance you can recall. Do not soften it to keep the peace. There is no peace left to keep. I nodded, taking a deep breath. This was it. The moment I finally opened the book of a lifetime of slights and recognized them for what they were, calculated theft. It started small, I began, my voice clear and steady, cutting through Diane's choked sobs. The laptop you bought me when I graduated high school. Mom told me the order got lost in transit, and the money had to be reallocated. Lacey was using a brand new, top-of-the-line laptop, the exact model I was supposed to get. Just 2 months later, she said her friend let her borrow it permanently. Grandma Ellen's face tightened. She remembered that gift, too, and the vague, unverified story about the lost order. Then there were the heirlooms, I continued, moving to another section of my internal ledger. Great-Grandma Tate's jewelry set. The agreement was that it would be split equally between Lacey and me after Grandma passed. Mom handled the distribution. I received a small, tarnished silver locket, all the substantial pieces, the diamond cluster ring, the gold filigree bracelet, are in Lacey's jewelry box. Mom said those pieces were too delicate for a girl who works in a hotel, and that Lacey would cherish them more. The accumulated weight of these smaller betrayals felt heavier than the car. They weren't just financial, they were emotional weapons designed to devalue me. But the most painful memory, the one that truly twisted the knife, involved a piece of paper I'd seen only once, decades ago. "And the savings bond," I said, my voice wavering slightly, but I forced it to stay firm. "The one you established in my name the day I was born. Mom always assured me it was safe, growing in a lockbox. She told me it would be my college nest egg." I looked straight at Diane, whose face was now a mask of pure terror. "When I was 17, I overheard Mom on the phone with a friend. She was talking about cashing in a policy to fix the roof. She assured the friend she'd pay it back before anyone noticed. The roof was never fixed. Instead, Mom and Lacey took a luxurious, week-long trip to the coast, talking about how much they deserved a vacation." I paused, letting the raw memory settle. I realized later she must have secretly redeemed that certificate of deposit, the one with my name on it, years before I was legally allowed to access it. All those years I thought I had a cushion. Mom had already spent it on herself and on Lacey's comfort. I admitted the most crippling part of the psychological damage, the reason I never challenged them. I blamed myself, I confessed, looking at my grandparents, not my mother. I always thought I was the problem. I thought I wasn't lovable enough, or smart enough, or feminine enough to deserve your generosity. I internalized Mom's messages that I was strong enough to cope and could handle a little less. So I worked the double shifts. I took the night hours. I drove the clunker. I broke my back because I truly believed I didn't deserve the help you were trying to give me. I quickly calculated the financial damage, adding up the documented gifts from Grandma's ledger, the conservative estimate of the savings bond, the value of the jewelry, and the car. "Conservatively," I stated, my voice clinical now, "the total value of what has been diverted, stolen, or otherwise withheld from me, meant specifically for my personal well-being or future, is easily between $50,000 and $60,000 over the last 7 years." A gasp was audible in the room, but it wasn't from me or my grandparents. It was from Diane's last, desperate attempt at self-preservation. "I was sacrificing for the family. I was trying to rebalance the resources," Diane shrieked, finally jumping off the ottoman and trying to approach me, hands outstretched in a pleading gesture. "You were the reliable one. I needed to make sure we got through the bad patches. You're stronger. Morgan, you can afford to miss a little. It was all for the family." I stepped back, putting distance between us, refusing the physical contact she sought as a diversion. For the first time, I didn't offer comfort or accept her narrative. "Strong doesn't mean I agree to be stolen from Mom," I fired back, the words sharp and final. "And being understanding doesn't mean I have to stay silent when I'm repeatedly and systematically defrauded. This wasn't an act of sacrifice. This was fraud. You didn't pool resources. You stole mine to subsidize Lacey's life and your own leisure." The power of that statement hung in the air. The transformation from dutiful daughter to aggrieved party was complete. Grandpa George didn't waste another moment. He reached for his phone again, but this time, his movements were slow, measured, and terrifyingly deliberate. He bypassed the car dealership contact. He looked at Diane, who was hyperventilating, and then at me, his eyes conveying a silent promise of allegiance. He tapped a contact and brought the phone to his ear. The dialing tone filled the room, a sound of imminent legal action. "Mr. Caldwell? Yes, it's George Tate. I apologize for calling on a Saturday afternoon, but this is an urgent matter of fiduciary concern. We've discovered a pattern of fraud and misappropriation of assets. Specifically, I require immediate legal counsel regarding the intentional deception and felony theft of my granddaughter's property by my daughter." He paused, listening to the stunned lawyer on the other end, then delivered the final, chilling confirmation that elevated this family drama into a legal nightmare. "Yes, I understand the severity. We need to discuss the elements of criminal fraud and conversion of property. My daughter, Diane, has committed intentional financial crimes against my granddaughter, Morgan. We are ready to press charges if necessary, or at the very least, establish a binding settlement. I want you to draw up the necessary papers right away. Grandpa George's phone call to Mr. Caldwell, the family's longtime corporate attorney, had dragged our domestic crisis screaming into the legal arena. The phone was still on speakerphone, and the lawyer's voice, though calm and measured, carried the undeniable weight of jurisdiction and consequence. George, based on your summary, the immediate issue with the vehicle transfer presents a clear case of conversion, possibly even grand theft auto depending on the value, but we need to establish the method used for the title change, Mr. Caldwell stated professionally. Specifically, who signed the transfer documents? Was it simply a verbal declaration to the dealership, or was there a forged signature on the official Department of Motor Vehicles paperwork? Grandpa George turned the phone slightly toward my mother, his eyes demanding her cooperation. Diane, still weeping uncontrollably, stammered out her confession. I signed it. I signed for Morgan. She admitted in a tiny mouse-like voice that was utterly foreign to the woman who had dominated our lives. The salesperson said Morgan needed to sign, but I told them she was too busy with her job and I was just handling it for her. I signed her name. I thought it was okay because it's all in the family. Mr. Caldwell absorbed the admission without a change in tone. His voice was now detached, listing facts like entries in a cold, hard spreadsheet. Ms. Tate, that is significantly more serious than a clerical error, forging a signature on a government document, changing the legal ownership of a 5-figure asset without the owner's authorization, and using the personal identifying information of another individual to do so. These are all actionable offenses. At minimum, it is considered unauthorized conversion and fraudulent conveyance. Depending on the district attorney's view, it easily enters the realm of felony forgery and possibly criminal theft. The room went silent again, only punctuated by Diane's ragged breathing. She finally understood that her attempt to play the role of the resource reallocator had put her in the crosshairs of the law. The fear in her eyes was no longer about family disapproval. It was about jail time. I was processing this information, my mind still reeling from the discovery of the $60,000 stolen, when Mr. Caldwell introduced the true coup de grace. The twist that proved the car was indeed only the tip of a much deeper, dirtier iceberg. Now, Mom, George, while reviewing Morgan's public credit file for any ancillary issues related to the title transfer, a routine precautionary measure, I noticed something unusual. The lawyer continued, Morgan, are you aware of a specific credit card account opened in your full name, under a major issuer, approximately 2 years ago? I blinked, momentarily confused. No, I said immediately. I have my own card, the one I opened when I got my job at Aspen Row. I pay that one off every month, but I have no other cards, absolutely none. This account was opened using your date of birth, social security number, and full name, Morgan Tate, Mr. Caldwell clarified. The billing statements, however, were directed not to your Denver apartment, but to the Tate family residence address, your parents' address. The account carries a balance of approximately $8,500, and it has been flagged for several late payments over the last 6 months. The shock was paralyzing. The theft wasn't just about taking money and gifts. It was about weaponizing my identity against my future. I realized with horrifying clarity that while I had been meticulously building my credit score by managing my small, self-acquired credit card, Diane had been quietly digging a financial pit under me. That debt, and those late payment flags, were now marring my carefully protected financial reputation, dragging my credit score down into the mud. My credit score, I whispered, the implications hitting me with a chilling finality. Every chance at a better apartment, a lower insurance rate, or even applying for a reasonable mortgage someday, all compromised by a debt I never incurred. Diane began babbling, trying to pull back the terrifying confession she had just made. I was just going to use it temporarily. The interest rate was really low, and I needed to pay for Lacey's medical bills for her ovarian cysts. And I thought if I used Morgan's name, the bank would give me a higher limit. I always intended to pay it off. I just fell behind the last few months. I never thought she wouldn't know. In that frantic jumble of excuses, she confirmed it. She had deliberately and fraudulently used my personal information to open a line of credit. Mr. Caldwell was unforgiving. Mrs. Tate, using your daughter's information without her express, written consent to incur debt under her name is not a financial hiccup. It is called identity fraud. Given the documented history of conversion of assets we've just discussed, and now the identity fraud leading to financial damage on Morgan's credit rating, this is no longer a matter of family disagreement. This is a serious criminal offense. If Morgan chooses to file a report with the police, this case moves entirely out of the realm of civil settlement. He paused, letting the magnitude of the legal disaster settle over the silent room. The decision now rests entirely with Morgan, the lawyer stated, addressing me directly through the phone. She is the victim of both financial fraud and identity theft. Her willingness to show leniency will dictate the next steps. Does she wish to pursue criminal charges, or does she prefer to negotiate a binding legal restitution and non-disclosure agreement? Grandpa George looked away from the phone and fixed his gaze entirely on me. His face was a roadmap of anguish and resolve. He made no attempt to sway me toward leniency or vengeance. "Morgan," he said, his voice stripped bare of his previous anger, filled only with support. "The choice is entirely yours. I will not push you, nor will I judge your decision, but I want you to know this. Whatever you choose, be it total forgiveness or full prosecution, your Grandma Ellen and I will stand fully behind you. There will be no more ambiguity. Your mother is on her own now, legally and morally." The floor was mine. For 25 years, I had been the one with no power, the one whose choices were always constrained by the needs and deceptions of others. Now, the full, devastating power of decision, the power to ruin my mother's life or dictate her future, had been suddenly and unequivocally placed in my hands. The silence was electric, filled with the sheer magnitude of the power that had suddenly been transferred to me. I had the choice: prison or binding restitution. For 25 years, my role had been limited to absorbing pain and accepting neglect. Now, I held the keys to my mother's future, and more importantly, the keys to my own financial and emotional freedom. I stood there, the weight of the moment pressing down, but I felt strangely calm. This wasn't about revenge in the typical sense. It was about reclaiming my reality. "Mr. Caldwell?" I said, addressing the lawyer's voice on the speakerphone, my voice steady and firm. "I don't want to see my mother go to prison. That's not my goal. But I cannot allow this to be wiped away as just a family matter that can be forgiven and forgotten." I glanced at Diane, who was watching me with desperate, pleading eyes, silently begging for the leniency she knew I was capable of granting. "I need documentation," I continued. "I need a formal, notarized, and legally binding acknowledgement of her fraudulent behavior, and I need a concrete plan for restitution that not only repays the money but also repairs the damage done to my credit and my future." "Mr. Caldwell immediately responded, his voice sounding relieved to move from potential criminal charges to negotiated civil settlement. "That is a wise and pragmatic approach. Morgan, we can draw up a comprehensive settlement agreement. I propose a 3-pronged solution, all contingent upon Mrs. Tate's immediate cooperation." He then outlined the legal framework. 1. Mrs. Tate signs a document formally acknowledging the acts of conversion of the vehicle and financial gifts, as well as the opening and use of the credit card in your name without authorization. This signed acknowledgement will be witnessed by your grandparents and myself. 2. We establish a repayment schedule for a significant, mutually agreed-upon portion of the estimated stolen funds. The $60,000 figure being a strong starting point, this will be secured and legally binding. 3. Most critically, Mrs. Tate must immediately sign all necessary documentation to either cancel that fraudulent credit card account or legally transfer 100% of the $8,500 balance and all associated late fees into an account solely under her name, legally absolving Morgan of all financial and credit liability. It was comprehensive, but I had one more essential condition, one that looked backward at the damage and forward at the necessary boundary. I agree to those terms, I stated. But I have an addition, an unnegotiable boundary for the future, Grandpa, Grandma. From this day forward, if you ever intend to give me any gift of money, stock, or any financial asset exceeding $100, it must be transferred directly into an account standing solely in my name, with no intermediaries, ever. The pipeline has to be direct. Grandpa George didn't hesitate. He slammed his hand lightly on the armrest, a gesture of absolute resolve. Done. That is a non-negotiable term for us as well. We will ensure all future transactions are directly deposited. Morgan, no more reliance on Diane's convenience. George then added a catastrophic condition of his own, directly addressing the breach of trust that impacted the entire Rockridge Millworks dynasty. Mr. Caldwell, he instructed the lawyer, I want you to immediately initiate the process of removing Diane as an executor or any other fiduciary agent in the family trust and my will. Her role as a co-trustee of any future assets designated for Morgan or Lacey must be revoked immediately. Any assets designated for Morgan must be established in a separate, independently managed trust. Diane let out a desperate, theatrical wail, the sound of her entire future power structure crumbling around her. Dad, you can't do that. That's disowning me. That's treating me like an outsider, she cried, tears streaming down her face. George's voice was ice cold. No, Diane. That is the only way I can guarantee you will never have the opportunity to steal from your own daughter again. You chose this path, not me. This is the consequence of that choice. I added the final, necessary emotional boundary, the one that defined my long-term emotional independence. And my condition is also for Lacey, I said, looking away from my mother's distress. From today, I will no longer take calls demanding that I share or that I should yield to my sister's greater need. Any help, financial or otherwise, that I give to Lacey will be my own active, unpressured decision. I will not be manipulated into subsidizing her life at the expense of my own anymore. Mr. Caldwell, sensing the conclusion of the negotiation, interjected to solidify the plan. Very well. I will begin drafting the acknowledgement and the restitution agreement immediately. I can be back at the Ridgeview house with the finalized, ready-to-sign documents in approximately 4 hours. I suggest everyone take this time to cool down and reflect. Grandpa George confirmed the meeting time, and the line went dead. A profound, suffocating silence descended upon the living room. Diane sank back onto the ottoman, burying her face in her hands, her sobs transforming into a desperate, wretched noise. But this time, no one rushed to her side. George and Ellen sat rigid in their chairs, staring into the middle distance, the weight of their daughter's decades-long betrayal heavy on their shoulders. I remained standing, leaning on the mantelpiece again, but this time, the cold stone felt like a foundation, not a refuge. Diane's tears, which had held so much manipulative power over me for so long, now felt hollow. I understood that they were not tears of genuine remorse for the damage done to me, but tears of fear for the loss of her control and her privileged position. Her anguish could not repay 25 years of stolen opportunities. The scales of justice were finally beginning to tilt, and the only path forward was the one paved with paper and law. The heavy silence following the lawyer's call was suddenly, violently shattered. Outside, tires screeched to a halt in the driveway, followed by the hurried slam of a car door. A moment later, Lacey burst into the living room. She was noticeably pregnant, her belly straining against a thick woolen dress, and her face was blotchy and pale with distress. Her hair was a mess, and her usual studied composure was completely absent. She had clearly been speeding and crying. Diane must have contacted her immediately after George called the lawyer, giving her a panicked, distorted account of events. Grandpa is taking your car. Morgan is trying to ruin me, and your entire life is under threat. Lacey didn't even look at Grandpa George or Grandma Ellen. Her entire focus was locked on me, her eyes blazing with a potent mix of fear and indignation. "What the hell is wrong with you? Morgan?" she shrieked, her voice high and unstable. She took a staggering step forward. "You're trying to take my car away? Now? While I'm pregnant and need it for appointments and getting to work? You are deliberately trying to make my life harder." The familiar sense of injustice, the way Lacey always centered herself as the ultimate victim, used to silence me, not anymore. I had just found out she was driving a car bought for me and that my mother had opened a credit card in my name. My voice was quiet, dangerously calm, cutting through her hysteria like glass. "Lacey," I said, not moving from my position by the mantelpiece. "I have a question, and I want you to answer truthfully, right now, in front of George and Ellen. When Mom handed you the keys to that black Toyota RAV4 3 months ago, did she, or did she not, tell you that the car was purchased by Grandpa George for my 25th birthday, and that the initial registration was filed in my name?" Lacey froze. The pure, unadulterated outrage drained from her face, replaced by a momentary flash of guilt, quickly masked by defiance. She looked at the floor, then at Diane, then back at me. "It was just paperwork," she spat out, refusing to meet my eyes. "Mom said there was a mix-up with the title and that she fixed it. She said she was paying for it for us. Since Mark's job fell through, I thought it was a family gift." "Did you ever ask," I pressed, the objectivity of my tone robbing her of a sympathetic audience, "why the sister who works 60 hours a week at a hotel to pay my own bills, was never asked for my driver's license, never asked to sign a single form, and was never even given the keys to a vehicle registered in my own name?" Lacey remained silent. Her refusal to acknowledge the obvious holes in Diane's narrative was her act of complicity. Grandpa George stepped in, his focus turning from the mother to the daughter who had consistently benefited from the fraud. "Lacey," he said, his voice deep with disappointment, "I have always been generous to you. I paid for your wedding. I paid for your honeymoon. Did you never stop to wonder why your older sister, Morgan, who is the most capable and hard-working of you both, always had to scramble for every dime? Why did you accept these gifts from your mother without question, gifts that seemed to fall from the sky?" Lacey finally burst into genuine, self-pitying tears, sinking onto the nearest sofa. "I thought I was lucky," she cried, rubbing her pregnant stomach defensively. I thought I deserved some good luck. Because of the stress of the pregnancy and Mark being out of work. I thought that maybe Mom and Dad just understood my life was harder right now." The words hung there, the lifelong rationalization of a privileged child. I deserve it. Therefore, I don't need to question where it came from. It was then that Grandma Ellen, ever the archivist of truth, delivered another damning piece of evidence, not to punish Lacey, but to expose the depth of Diane's manipulation. "Lacey, this has been going on for a long time," Grandma Ellen said, her voice heavy with sorrow. "It's not just the car. Morgan, do you remember that time you were 20 and I told you I was mailing you a surprise check?" I nodded slowly. "Yes, Mom called me right after and asked if I'd received it. When I said no, she said, 'Oh, that's just like Grandma. She probably forgot to put a stamp on it. Don't mention it again.'" Grandma Ellen held up a photocopied piece of paper, an old bank record. "I sent Morgan a cashier's check for $2,000 that year, directly to her apartment address, using registered mail. When I asked Diane about it later, she told me Morgan had lost it and was too embarrassed to say anything. Just last night, I called the bank and asked them to trace the cashed check." She placed the copy gently on the coffee table. The endorsement line was clear, written in Diane's recognizable handwriting, directly depositing the funds into one of her own hidden accounts. Lacey looked from the paper to her mother, her face draining of color, the realization that her comfort was built not on fortune, but on her sister's misfortune, was finally crashing down. The car was one lie, the laptop was another. This check was physical proof that her mother had been systematically stealing from Morgan's mailbox, her name, and her future for over a decade. I didn't try to comfort Lacey. I couldn't. "Lacey, I'm not attacking you," I said, my voice low and level. "You are a victim of Mom's manipulative parenting. Absolutely. She raised you to believe you were entitled and raised me to believe I was disposable. But you are 22 years old and carrying a child. You are not a little girl anymore. The moment you saw that new car, and saw the photo Mom sent to Grandpa that wasn't you, and still chose to get behind the wheel and accept it as a gift, you became a part of the problem. You looked at the giant, flashing ethical warning signs, and you consciously decided to close your eyes and reap the benefits. This was the boundary I had to set with my sister: accountability. Grandpa George stood up, towering over the room, and delivered the final, non-negotiable decree. "The car is leaving today," he announced to Lacey, his voice devoid of emotion. "Mr. Caldwell will ensure the title is immediately transferred back to the dealership and then put into Morgan's name, just as it was originally intended. The SUV will be towed here and stored in the garage until Morgan decides what she wants to do with it. Your credit card debt of $8,500, which was opened using Morgan's identity, will be paid off by Diane and transferred to her account within 48 hours. This ends now." Lacey stared up at her grandfather, tears streaming down her face for real this time. The tears of someone whose safety net has just been shredded. "So what do I have left?" Lacey choked out, the question raw and desperate. "What about the baby? What about Mark? You're leaving me with nothing." I walked toward the door, preparing to meet Mr. Caldwell later. I paused and looked back at Lacey, pregnant and vulnerable on the sofa. I felt no satisfaction, only a weary kind of peace. "You have the chance to start over," I told her, my answer completely devoid of malice, but full of clear-eyed truth. "You have the chance to start building a life based on what you and Mark earn, on the things you create for yourselves, not on the money and opportunities that were stolen from your sister. That, Lacey, is the only real foundation worth having." I didn't wait for a response. I walked out of the living room, leaving behind the wreckage of 25 years of family history, knowing that for the first time, I wasn't running away. I was walking toward my own future, one free of lies and debt, one that Morgan Tate, was finally in charge of. The late afternoon brought with it the scent of a brewing storm and the arrival of Mr. Caldwell, the family lawyer. He arrived precisely on time, carrying a hefty briefcase that contained the freshly drafted instruments of peace and destruction. The living room, once the heart of family gatherings, now functioned as an austere conference room. George and Ellen sat together, united in their grim resolve. Diane and Lacey sat on the sofa, their bodies tense, whispering anxiously to each other like co-conspirators who had just realized their bond was rooted in shared guilt. I stood apart, a witness and the central figure of the transaction. Mr. Caldwell began the proceedings by handing Diane the first document, the acknowledgement of conduct and intentional fraud. "Mrs. Tate," the lawyer stated, his voice professional and impersonal. "This document details the specific actions taken. The unauthorized transfer of the vehicle title originally registered to Morgan Tate, the misdirection and conversion of financial gifts from Mr. and Mrs. Tate intended for Morgan, and the use of Morgan Tate's personal information to open a credit account in her name without her consent." The language was precise, legal, and devastating. Diane's hands were visibly shaking as she read the summary of her life's secret project. The document didn't call her a thief, but every paragraph confirmed she had acted as one. She glanced at me, her eyes red and puffy, searching for a last sliver of pity. I gave her none. Finally, with a shuddering breath, Diane took the pen and signed the document, her signature messy and uncertain, a stark contrast to the clean, bold lines of the contract. It was done. The truth was now legally binding and undeniable. Next was the financial restitution agreement. Given the difficulty in definitively tracking every small gift over 25 years, Mr. Caldwell explained, we have agreed to a fixed settlement number that addresses the major documented thefts. Mrs. Tate will be legally obligated to repay $45,000 to Morgan Tate over a fixed period of 5 years, starting next month. This is formally recognized as a debt, not a loan, and is secured by a lien on an asset, which we will discuss later. The amount was substantial enough to mark the gravity of the crime, yet reasonable enough to ensure Diane wouldn't face bankruptcy or prison. It was real-life revenge, the forced acknowledgement that I was owed this money, not that I was simply forgiven. Immediately following the restitution plan, Mr. Caldwell presented the credit card documents. These were the most crucial for my future. These documents confirm that the balance of $8,500 on the fraudulently opened card has been paid in full by Mrs. Tate this afternoon, and the entire account is now being transferred exclusively into Mrs. Tate's personal liability. Furthermore, Mrs. Tate is signing a notarized affidavit stating she committed identity theft to open the account, which Morgan can use to petition credit bureaus to legally remove all negative marks associated with this account from her file. Diane signed these papers just as quickly, desperate to erase the threat of criminal prosecution hanging over her head. The burden of debt and the shame of financial ruin were finally being shifted back to the perpetrator. Then came the grand climax, the institutional and enduring shift in power. Mr. Caldwell stepped back, and Grandpa George picked up a slim, separate file, distinct from the restitution papers. "This is not a settlement document," George announced, addressing the entire room, his voice echoing with the authority of the patriarch and the founder. "This is my updated estate plan." Diane and Lacey both leaned forward, shock and panic replacing their previous anxiety. This was the real battleground, the future of the family wealth. As of last week, when I began to suspect the car was diverted, I initiated changes to my will and the family trust structure regarding Rockridge Millworks, George stated. The primary share of voting stock and the controlling interest in the company will no longer be inherited jointly by Diane, or later, Lacey. He looked directly at me. Effective immediately. The majority of the controlling interest in Rockridge Millworks, roughly 60%, is being established in a managed trust fund for Morgan Tate. The condition for her full control is the successful completion of an executive management program and a minimum of 2 years of direct administrative apprenticeship, which I will personally fund and oversee. Lacey gasped, a loud, ragged sound. She had been raised her entire life to believe she was the heir apparent, the delicate princess who would one day inherit the family's legacy. In one sentence, that assumption had been pulverized. The shares previously earmarked for Diane have been substantially reduced to a small, non-voting block, George continued, looking at his daughter with sorrow, not anger. And Lacey, your inheritance, while still significant, is no longer a controlling interest. It will be protected in a separate trust, ensuring no one can use it to fund irresponsible ventures, or worse, steal from another family member. George laid the documents on the table, the sound of the paper slapping the wood echoing the finality of his decision. "This is not punishment," he declared, his gaze sweeping across Diane and Lacey. "This is a rebalancing of the scales. The person who was consistently denied opportunity, who was forced to build her life with nothing, is now being granted the resources and the structure to lead the company. And those who have shown a pattern of financial irresponsibility and deception are being stripped of the power to cause further damage. If anyone here is dissatisfied with the terms of my will, you are free to consult your own lawyer and contest it. But be warned, you will be bringing the full story of today's events into open court." I walked over and accepted the folder from Mr. Caldwell's hand. The papers felt heavy, not just with the weight of money, but with the weight of justice. This was real-life revenge, not a dramatic explosion, but a quiet, legally sound restructuring of reality. It wasn't about making them suffer. It was about elevating myself to the position I should have been in all along. The whole family structure had been violently rearranged, and for the first time in my life, Morgan Tate was finally standing on solid ground. The intense, clinical atmosphere of the family meeting broke around 7 p.m. Just as the cold twilight settled over Ridgeview, Mr. Caldwell departed with the signed acknowledgement of fraud, the restitution schedule, and the updated will, leaving behind a family in ruins and a path toward my future finally cleared. Outside, The last piece of the immediate injustice was being rectified. The sound of a large tow truck engine backing into the driveway drew me out onto the porch. The vehicle being delivered wasn't the truck. It was the black Toyota RAV4, towed from Lacey's possession, its temporary, fraudulent owner, and brought back to its rightful registry address. I walked down the cobblestone path toward the truck. The SUV, still gleaming and new, stood under the porch light. I was seeing it, truly seeing it, for the first time. The vehicle that had triggered the entire demolition of my family's lies. It should have been mine 3 months ago. The tow truck operator, a kind man with a tired face, climbed down and approached me. He carried a small clipboard and a leather key fob. "Morgan Tate?" he asked. "Yes," I confirmed. He handed me the clipboard for a final signature and then, the moment that felt like the true finale, he placed the heavy key fob directly into my hand. "Here you go. It's all registered in your name now. Enjoy the ride." The cold metal of the key felt monumental, a symbol of freedom and ownership. It wasn't just the key to a car. It was the key to my own life, a graduation diploma from the lifelong role of the overlooked and abused daughter. I glanced up at the large front window of the living room. Silhouettes were pressed against the glass, watching me. I could see the distinct outlines of Diane, Lacey, and my father, who had remained silent throughout the day's legal storm, a ghost in his own marriage. Each one represented a different form of loss. Diane, the fear of exposure and financial consequence; Lacey, the raw anger of losing her comfort blanket; and my father, the regret of passive inaction. Yet, despite the chaos and their desperation, none of them rushed out to try and reclaim the keys or the territory. The tide had turned. The balance had shifted permanently. As I checked the driver's side door, Lacey emerged onto the porch, her pregnant figure wrapped in a thick shawl. She looked small and lost, her face blotchy. She started to speak, but her words died in her throat. I met her eyes. I could see the confusion, the self-pity, and perhaps a tiny flicker of understanding of the enormity of her mother's sin and her own complicity. I didn't offer comfort, only the firm boundary I had established with the lawyer. "Lacey," I said simply, "when you are ready to genuinely apologize for the opportunities and assets you enjoyed at my expense, I will listen, but that conversation is not for today." Diane then rushed out, attempting one last desperate, emotional ploy. "Morgan, please, honey," she pleaded, her voice cracking. "Just one hug. Let me hold you. I'm still your mother." I stepped back, maintaining the physical distance I needed. "Not now, Mom," I stated gently but firmly. "I need time to learn how to trust that you won't try to take anything from me ever again. Emotional contact is off the table until I have that certainty." Grandpa George and Grandma Ellen walked toward me, their faces solemn but proud. "This car is yours, Morgan, completely yours," Grandpa George emphasized. "And I want you at Rockridge Millworks tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. We need to begin your management training program immediately. You have a company to learn how to run." It was the ultimate vindication, not just the return of a car, but the offer of an entire legacy, the chance to step into the future I had been unwittingly preparing for through years of hard work. I slid into the driver's seat. The scent of new leather and manufactured possibility filled the cabin. I adjusted the rearview mirror, and I saw my reflection. Not the exhausted, accommodating girl who had stepped out of the Uber earlier, but a woman with sharp, clear eyes, who had just spent a single afternoon redefining her relationship with her entire family. My phone began to vibrate incessantly on the passenger seat, a deluge of frantic text messages from Diane and Lacey, full of pleas, recriminations, and self-justifications. I reached over, tapped the screen, and switched the ringer and notifications to silent mode. I decided then and there that all future communication would be on my terms, scheduled at my convenience, and filtered through the boundaries I had just established. I turned the ignition. The engine hummed to life, a powerful, quiet roar. I pulled the black RAV4 out of the driveway, away from the red brick house and the shadows of my past. As I merged onto the highway, leaving the tight, claustrophobic world of Ridgeview behind, the lights of Denver spread out before me, a glittering, expansive future that had finally, justly, been returned to me. The story ended not with a cry of triumph, but with the quiet, profound peace of a woman finally driving her own life. Thank you so much for listening to Morgan's story. Let me know in the comments below where you're tuning in from, and share your thoughts on Morgan's choices. Don't forget to subscribe to Lila Revenge Stories, smash that like button, and hit the hype button to help this story be heard by more people.